Okay, so welcome everyone to another one of the topic discussions. Today we're going to be looking at the sort of overall topic of how to make legitimate Cassus Belli, and also how to deal with escalation of conflict into like proper full-on wars. The different sort of individual topics that we're going to be looking at today is what constitutes a valid Cassus Belli, what is a distinct situation where a nation would officially declare war, how to handle escalation of conflict and do it in a way that actually makes sense and is organic, how to conduct wars or conflicts without an official declaration of combat, how to build up and start a war properly from the ground up, what not to do when escalating a conflict, and what does not constitute a valid Casus Belli. So the first thing is obviously what constitutes a valid Casus Belli. Well, first off, you need a distinct reason to go to war. Nations don't fight each other for, let's just say, small reasons. We'll get into non-official wars or conflicts later on. But official, straight-up nation versus nation combat is pretty rare, and for a full-on star empire at least to declare war and start attacking another one, there has to be a valid reason. And these can come in like a different number of different things. Essentially, you're going to at least want a large build-up and context for your reason. Whatever the reason is, whether it's some small or large reason, there has to be a build-up to it. Nations don't just decide one day to invade another one. It's usually because of previous conflicts or diplomatic disagreements or internal problems with your nation. But a couple of example valid Casus Belli would be, for example, for the Second Ancerious War at least, there was huge ideological differences between one of the nations and another, the one who started the war. But that wasn't the sole reason. There was also economic problems that were going on, and there was a diplomatic war sort of going on behind the scenes in policies and politics, with the two nations sort of trying to bring others into their spheres of influence and trying to outpace each other militarily. But the sort of valid Casus Belli that came to the fore there was the whole situation was eventually going to end up in some sort of conflict, whether it was going to be an outright war or dozens of small proxy wars. But in the end, the other nation decided that it was going to declare war and just start the whole thing off because it was going to happen anyway. Some of the other times that you would officially declare war is if there's been a number of large diplomatic incidents, you've suffered lots of loss of life, loss of territory because of either another nation, indirectly or directly, and you are in a position where you can probably take what you want from them in a way that makes you look, I guess, on the morally superior side. Again, sort of nations don't declare war for pointless reasons, and especially in the public eye, they'll want to make it so that they're, I guess, on the moral high ground. So it might look like, we're doing this for the greater good of the region because this particular empire has been going around causing a load of problems, causing trade issues, economic collapse. They've disrupted civilian operations in these several solar systems. They've caused, through their various operations, loss of life from these several different nations. They've been sabotaging elements and trying to conduct trade wars on us. And, we've also got a historical sort of precedent with this nation that's been going on. We're going to go and essentially occupy them and ensure that these elements within their government are going to be pretty much taken out of the equation so that this will never happen again. this sort of ties into the what is the distinct situation to officially declare war. Um, it it usually has to be pretty public, um, and this is kind of a complex situation because it really depends on the context of the situation. Um, if you have, or you're writing a story where you have two sides and they have a long history of different conflicts, both open and, I guess, behind the scenes, shall we say, and unofficial, the only time that they're really going to officially have a proper war will be trying to make some sort of political statement or trying to make some sort of statement in general to the rest of the galaxy or other factions. So, again, the case in point for the example was in the Second Ancerious War at the very start, the Grand Empire Capital declared war on the Union of Worlds outright, publicly, as a statement to say, we are going to stand up to the things that these guys are pushing on the galactic stage, and we're willing to do so openly. Therefore, anyone else who's also going to stand with us should stand with us right now. And that's what happened. The nations of their alliance, the APP, also went to their aid, and vice versa, and the whole war kicked off. Um, but yeah, you really need to have good context for what constitutes a casus belli. There's no real right or wrong answer, I guess, overall. Especially when we get to the sort of how to conduct wars and conflicts without an official declaration of conflict. Those are much more common. But yeah, essentially overall you want a really in-depth reason with prior context, probably with historical relevance to previous events over, decades, or I guess if you really want to push it, centuries, but it needs to make sense on the galactic scale with different nations. It needs to fit the narrative as well. Um, Wars are pretty disruptive for both roleplay and also story in general, so don't just go about willy-nilly declaring war on people. But yeah, I guess that's sort of the way that I would put it across, in that there's a load of different ways to make it valid. Context is key, and build-up is key. But does anyone else have any sort of ideas or sort of stuff to put forward there?
Yeah, I've got a little bit actually.
Go for it.
Um, so on the topic of legitimate casus belli, there are uh, what you've said is generally true for basically every single type of government. It's true of liberal democracies. In fact, it's even more true of liberal democracies. Liberal democracies very rarely go to war. It takes quite a lot to push a liberal democracy into war. Uh, Technocracies are also typically very nervous to go to war. Most governmental systems won't go to war quickly. It's quite hard to push them over that edge. Because at the end of the day, the state's function is to ensure the state continues to exist. And a war is a massive risk.
Absolutely.
So but while it's generally true, that does imply that there are specific moments where casus belli can come, like legitimate ones can just come out of nowhere. For example, military alliances are an immediate, legitimate reason to declare war on another state. If you have a defense treaty with another nation and a third party declares war on them, that's it. It's go time. Your casus belli is immediately legitimate because you're honoring an agreement you made with another nation. And if you don't honor your treaties, people are very quickly going to start distrusting you. You've got all the reason in the world to join the war. Hyper-religious states, especially Crusader nations, the Yosians, for example, that's another example of a state that's much quicker to rise to the occasion of war. Because the thing about a legitimate casus belli is that the legitimate part is it has to be legitimate for you. So, for example, the United States isn't going to declare war on Afghanistan and justify it with the Ninth Crusade. But weapons of mass destruction, that checks out, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way of putting it across. Although I would say, even with the super duper religious crusaders or the devouring swarms or whatever, this kind of constitutes into a topic that we talked about before, which is they don't they will obviously always have a legitimate casus belli to them of you're not them, therefore they're going to kill you. But I don't think that means that they should ever just throw themselves into conflict. Because even those... No, don't worry, I'm not saying that you insinuated that. I'm just adding this on as a sort of a tacked on. Though they will always have legitimate reasons to go to war with other nations, they should never just sort of overwhelm themselves, so to say. So they shouldn't declare war on every single nation they find, because, well, they're going to end up in a situation like Germany did in World War II, where they turned around and they got in, they took on far too many enemies, which were on par, if not much more powerful than them, and they just got steamrolled. So, in my opinion, they should definitely have a very easy way to go to war with other nations, but that doesn't mean that they should be stupid in how they do so. For sure.
No, you're right. Well, yeah, no, you're right. What I meant by a bit easier to rise to the occasion of war is that there's no voting in a theocracy. There's no you don't have to worry about your constituents. And also religious fervor against something particularly blasphemous is, I think, what would lead a theocracy to war. You wouldn't see someone that doesn't follow your religion and instantly snap to war. Not if you're a space empire that's this big. You wouldn't have made it this far. I think a good example would be the Anointed have a religious iconoclasticity of humanity, right? But they're not out there fighting every single war on behalf of every single human faction in the server. What they will do, however, is when it comes to things like slavery against especially against humans, that's enslaving humans would be like bombing Mecca to them. And you can imagine what would happen if you bombed Mecca. You'd get a war, and it'd be chips down time. When a theocracy goes to war, it goes to war over something some major slight against their religion.
Yeah. For sure.
Singapore's not going to invade France because of Charlie Hebdo drawing Muhammad comics. But if France carpet bombed Mecca, they just might.
Yeah, I think the point earlier that was made about the whole military alliances thing, that's also kind of interesting, because that is both a valid but also an invalid one, in my opinion, because of course you will turn around and be yeah, we're going to honour this agreement to help defend you, but that doesn't, in my opinion, mean that you're automatically going to have your nation go to war. And the reason this is because you can see it IRL with quite a lot of instances where nations have gone into conflicts and their allies are actually reluctant to help out. Or if they do help out, they only help out to a limited extent. I mean, for example, what we've just had, the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. And while Armenia is in the CSTO, which is kind of, the Eastern Russian equivalent of NATO, not all of the CSTO states actually helped Armenia, and in some cases actually worked against them. And it's also the same in when the whole thing with NATO happened. Even though they went in and did Desert Storm or whatever, not all the NATO countries contributed frontline military forces or whatnot. or the like. And it's sort of that thing of, just because you're in, say, a large military alliance and some sort of conflict happens with the members of that alliance, it doesn't mean that everyone in the alliance has to immediately, obviously, like, just go, oh, yeah, we declare war, now we're going to go to war footing and send all our forces in. They might sort of turn around and be like, okay, well, we'll send you a small fleet and we'll provide you with, civilian and economic aid, but we've got our own problems or whatnot. Obviously, that's going to affect you diplomatically and politically, that of course, but especially if it's the case of like, oh, I'm going to war with another nation on the other side of the galaxy, and somebody, you turn around and be like, well, okay, good for you. I'm not going to come join you. And then they might be like, oh, well, we're in a military alliance, you should come join us. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to honour the agreement.
I think that has more to do with escalation, how you engage in a conflict. I was just saying that the military alliance gives you legitimate Cassus Belli, not necessarily that you will act on every legitimate Cassus Belli you ever receive.
Yeah, I mean, this also kind of goes into what's not a legitimate Cassus Belli, but yeah, it's sort of like pre-touching on it.
Yeah, that's all I've got. Just that feudal empires, religious theocracies, and all that, and liberal democracies, they're all going to have different reasons. They're all going to have things that they consider different legitimate Cassus Belli. The most important thing about determining whether or not a Cassus Belli is legitimate is whether it makes sense for your people.
Yep. That sums it up pretty perfectly. Alright. Any questions on those points, or shall we move on to the next subject? Okay, I'm going to take that as a sort of moving on. So I guess we'll move on to the how to handle direct escalation, considering that we also kind of touched on the distinct situations to officially declare war. But so how to handle an escalation of a conflict so that it makes sense? Well, first off, it depends on what stage of any form of conflict that you're at. If you've just had a border skirmish, okay, where a couple of fleets of about 10 ships have somehow, over some accident, started firing on each other, that does not mean that you can then grab 500 warships and a super weapon and just immediately jump them into the opponent's systems and start blowing them up. That doesn't work. It also doesn't mean that border skirmish will immediately start a conflict. Nations in real life, and also I'm very much imagining space empires, will do everything they can to de-escalate a conflict. As Jesse said earlier, wars are massive affairs. They mean loss of life, they mean loss of economy, they mean political instability, and they mean turmoil, and they mean a lot of assets lost. Nations will try to avoid war as much as they possibly can. So if you get into a small, tizzy, I guess, with another nation, that's not grounds for conflict. And realistically, unless there's some other underlying thing going on where those two nations are in some sort of Cold War, or they don't like each other, or they're sort of toying with each other through proxy wars, then maybe that little border skirmish may spark into something more. But on the whole, little conflicts would probably only lead to diplomatic sort of confrontations over the galactic stage, so to say. But if you have a dedicated little skirmish, and you are in a situation where it makes sense that, maybe we should send them a message, that, again, doesn't mean that you can just jump all of your ships in and go ham. It will mean that you would maybe send a small raiding force, destroy a few of their outposts that are near that region. The enemy may then do the same in return, and then it might slowly escalate, and then those raiding forces might encounter one another, and then there might be another small skirmish, and then that might escalate. And then perhaps through that small skirmish, where there's been a load of destroyers having a fight over the border, one side might be like, well, I'll bring in a cruiser division, and then that then escalates, and then more forces get drawn in and drawn in and drawn in. Or they might then think to themselves, well, we keep getting hit again in this region. They brought in this cruiser division. We're going to strike their infrastructure in the area, not just their outposts, but we're also going to target planets and military installations. And then you have a sort of organic, I guess, build-up where your faction is slowly deploying more and more of its more, I guess, more powerful assets. In a way that makes sense. I mean, IRL, you don't see a border conflict and then Russia launching all of its nuclear weapons at another state. What you normally do is you see a border conflict and then nothing. Or there might be an escalation of that conflict into use of artillery by either side, and then, a couple of hundred dead, then nothing. Or maybe then artillerying infrastructure like roads and some military bases on either side, and then maybe nothing. Or there might be then some airstrikes, or used by helicopter gunships, or maybe there might be then one side might use cruise missiles, and it kind of just goes from there. But there needs to be a defined escalation. It needs to make sense from the moment that somebody starts shooting, that whatever happens afterwards is going to, I guess, get to the situation where, okay, there's now fleets of thousands of ships fighting each other. You want to be able to look back and see how that started. And be like, okay, that makes sense. There was all these escalations around here, small attacks, small retaliatory attacks, escalations using different weapon systems, and then eventually actual proper fleets deployed. Maybe war happens, although it doesn't need to, but we'll get to that in a bit. And then next thing you know, you've got full-on attack fleets and war fleets being mobilised from fleet reserves and shoved into battle. But you always want to make it so that it's organic. Because there's nothing worse than just watching a small engagement suddenly get rammed full of 1,000 ships. But anyone else, feel free to shove on anything more that they want on that topic.
Yeah. Man, this is another one about non-standard types of government. Their escalations still happen. Every type of government escalates into conflicts, but escalations look different depending on what sort of government and species you are. So, most, technocracies, liberal governments, super corporations and all that, their escalations will all look pretty well what Mike just described. The greatest majority of factions in the game, or in the server, will look like that. Crusader states are another example again. They will still have an escalation. A ship's not going to explode and the whole country yeets itself into a war. Typically, the way that a theocracy will escalate a conflict is a lot of it will actually happen inside their own borders. It'll be essentially a whipping up of religious fervor to convince people that to go on a crusade. The escalations of conflicts might even be invisible to the rest of the galaxy, to a certain extent. But there is an escalation. You will have journals that you should be posting that's like theocrat growing upset, preaching something negative about the nation in church, people then spreading that word to other followers, other priestly class members latching onto that message. And as the nation whips itself up into more and more of a fervor, there might not be any more external conflicts, but then one day you just have a crusade on your hands. The kickoff point for that's probably going to have to be pretty big. It's not going to be a border skirmish. It's not going to be one ship blowing up. But your escalation still looks natural from a storytelling perspective, despite not involving anyone else, just because you have such a strange type of government. Essentially, it's again just another repeating of the point from the last one, escalations just have to look natural for you. Yeah, that's it.
I think a good analogy would be in any sort of escalation. Imagine it as a set of scales, and you've got a specific tipping point, and after that tipping point, it's pretty much full-on conflict. That's it. Your nation is going to war with another nation. Now, you don't just turn up and shove like a 1 ton weight on the scales. That's not really what happens. You slowly build it up piece by piece, and you get it to that knife edge. And then some event is what's placed on top, and that's what tips it over the edge. That is how you should get there. And if somebody looks at the conflict and looks at the, that was obviously the knife edge of the conflict. I wonder what was all of the things before it. You can have diplomatic problems between your two nations. You could have economic problems in your own nation. I mean, you can use conflict as a unifying force within a faction, and it's happened numerous times in Ancerious before anyway, let alone God knows however many RP groups. So you can have internal divides, you can have political disagreements and problems that's gone on. You could have social upheaval. You can have, ethnic qualms between the two factions, religious qualms, all these different things which normally would be like, yeah, it's a bit of a problem, but so what, no reason to fight over it, all add up until you get a point of, well, this is now going to turn into some sort of conflict. And the moment one side wants a conflict, they can start planting stuff to try and make it a conflict. Where, okay, they can have their ships accidentally start buzzing the other person's territory, going in, getting very close to, say, military outposts or other patrol fleets, and then breaking off. Sort of like how Russia and the US today do buzzing each other's airspaces with bombers. But obviously, if a nation specifically wants a conflict, they can try and, engineer some sort of accident where they might lose some forces and then blame it on the other side. Gives them a chance to then strike maybe a few of their positions, claim that it was a retaliation and it was all fair and good, and then the other side might then retaliate in return, and then you start getting the old, one-upmanship until you get a full-on proper conflict. But again, it completely depends, because war is a massive drain. And it should, as we said, have context for why it's happening and why factions would want to go to war. Whether that is whipped up religious fervour or, hell, even non-religious fervour, to be perfectly honest with you, or for economic reasons or whatever. Just make sure that the build-up on the knife edge and then the knife edge itself makes sense. And after that, you're good. You can then have a fight to your heart's content. But the build-up is quite hard. And it's quite complex. Any questions on that particular point? Or other things that people want to discuss? Okay, no problem. So the next point is how to conduct wars or conflicts without an official declaration. So this is actually really easy, because most conflicts that you will see in modern day are not wars, not in the traditional sense of the word. No country declares war anymore, officially, because it's politically and legally like a total nightmare. It means that you then have to negotiate an end, you have to have fixed treaties, you have to acknowledge that there's a war going on, and then you have to have people that have to come in and observe. And Ancerios is probably much the same with the different unaligned and the sort of non-aligned organisations of the galaxy. Um, so IRL at least, and I could definitely imagine so in the group, countries go to war without legally saying so. They go in, they escalate, they fight, they take a bit of territory or carry out an objective, and then once that's done, they step back and they say, yep, we're not fighting anymore. And then what can the enemy do? They've lost in that particular engagement, they've lost their objective, they can't try to force the other side to the negotiating table because officially there's not a conflict. Also, if there's not an official conflict, it means that things can escape underneath the radar better, and it means that you can conduct operations without being seen so much on the wider, I guess, galactic community. Like today, there's tons of little conflicts going on. None of them are officially big wars, which means the media doesn't cover them most often than not, and it means that different factions get away with all sorts of things. It's also depending on whether the actual state or faction is recognised by the other nations. I mean, if they're not recognised and they officially declare war, well, if nobody recognises you, nobody cares. That's just I guess, a non-legal conflict. But it would definitely be a large thing in Ancerios to go and have some sort of conflict with another nation, send forces in, conduct whatever objectives you want, and then just pull out, or to just walk away and leave the other guy pretty much hanging on a thread, because while they also then have grounds to attack you and escalate further, unless they make it official, then you can look like you have the moral high ground. And this sort of goes in the fact that most conflicts would be quiet wars, or sort of wars behind the scenes, with different proxies, mercenary groups fighting each other, different special forces, underground elements, paid-off criminal elements, all sorts. Any way to try and take your opponent down or to diminish their stature would likely be going on, all without an official declaration of conflict. And there's been nothing the enemy obviously can do directly, but be forced to fight on your terms, which would be hiring underground elements, doing quiet wars, and the like. Otherwise, they just get outmaneuvered. So yeah, not really sure what else to add there. I guess, Vic, are you there? You're the sort of kind of guy who does things
Yeah,
without conflict, like official declaration of wars. What do you have to say on the subject?
I mean, fighting a war without declaring war is pretty straightforward. Just don't declare war. The thing where it actually gets interesting, in my opinion, is fighting a war without actually directly confronting the enemy, which is where you get, I think, as Marek mentioned before, several ways to like apply pressure on an enemy without actually like going there and bombing them, such as using different all sorts of proxy movements, like terrorist groups, guerrillas, sort of renegade rogue armies or whatever, and they don't really have to be on your ideological side. They don't. The people that you're supporting don't really have to be aligned with you in any way. Like for example, Pakistan supported the Naxalite movement in India. The Naxalites are communists, and it's illegal to be a communist in Pakistan. But Pakistan, the only thing that they want to do is destabilize India and just keep like turn the whole Naxalite guerrilla into a just this money pit. So when you're waging this kind of proxy shadow war against an enemy, it really doesn't matter who is gonna do the shooting or why. You just give them guns and just give them money, and the enemy is most likely gonna do the same to you. Where it gets interesting is that if you give too much power and too much money and armaments to the irregular movements that you're supporting, then at that point they might start attacking you. Like it's basically going to be inevitable that they start also attacking you because you're in close contact with them and maybe like even geographically if you border the person that you're going to go to war with. And there you get the question of like, when does it stop being acceptable collateral to just get like car bombed every week, as long as the enemy gets car bombed twice every week, for example. Another way of this kind of non-war war gets fought is politically through international organizations. You kind of stack them in your favor. You're in favor of like the World Health Organization or the United Nations International Atomic Energy Agency or the FAA or all those things that then you can start or like for like I think the biggest example will be the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. The United States can then utilize to further its geopolitical goals on a global scale. So these organizations, which are pretty powerful just due to their enormous size and the fact that they kind of go work beyond national borders, can also be used as a proxy if you just like throw enough money and to get you enough of your people in there. Besides that, I guess you could get into economic war, where you're targeting, you're talking to your enemy's trade partners and offering them better deals and trying to undercut them out of like trying to form trade deals like the United States tried to do in 2006 with the TPP, where they wanted to surround China with a whole bunch of countries that were part of a treaty that have certain standards on like labor like laws and intellectual property and whatnot, so that China, who has factories and like secondary producers in all of those countries around, would be forced to sort of bend to the US as well. And yeah,
I think that
I
covers it
guess if
pretty
you're a
well.
corporation, it becomes even easier, or at least you get even more options because you don't really have to answer to any sort of like national constituency or any like fixed identity. You're just a corporation. You're a pile of money. You can rebrand. You can distribute your assets among other corporations. You can even like sort of buy your way into the enemy and whatnot.
I think the whole like fighting the conflict without actually declaring war as well is a great means of actually having a build up to a proper upfront war. Where, you know, for years you've been funding insurgents in the enemy territory, they've been doing the same for you. There's ongoing small proxy conflicts, you've been trying to politically outmaneuver each other, you've been trying to economically undermine each other, and then obviously some sort of flashpoint kicks off, and it suddenly becomes a question of, do and can we keep going with this undercover war where we've basically we've been draining and drained for years, or do we actually just straight up end this and fight this conflict and see how the outcome is by the end of it? Um, and then obviously that happens and the actual proper conflict kicks off while the proxy elements are still going on behind the scenes, and that then adds another interesting level to the conflict, in my opinion.
One of the big things about declaring or like issuing a formal declaration that a lot of people forget about is the actual legal ramifications of a declaration of war. During the Falklands conflict, the United Kingdom actually made a very conscious decision to not formally declare war on Argentina. One of the big problems of declaring war is that it leads to third-party nations having certain responsibilities towards those two conflicting nations. So, for example, the UK didn't declare war on Argentina because a lot of the United Kingdom's, a lot of companies in the United Kingdom actually sold quite heavily to Argentina. And that if they declared war on Argentina, they'd have to stop. bordering nations are typically required to essentially not allow military assets of two warring nations to move through their territory. But if you never declare war, you just sort of can. Typically, wars will lead to like the detaining of citizens and property, which can cause, again, a whole other slew of issues, especially if you're two states that have been trading with each other for a long time. Essentially, a formal declaration of war carries with it a certain amount of legal baggage that just isn't worth it most of the time. It's why nations don't formally declare war nowadays. It's just too much hassle.
I think, especially with the...
just call it an emergency. Just call it an emergency and send an army anyway.
Yeah, I think that also ties in with what we were saying about I guess the more unconventional nations earlier. I mean, if you're a ravening machine empire that has literally no regard for any sort of galactic treaty or whatever, it's not going to officially declare war on you. There's going to be escalations, and then all of a sudden you're going to have 20,000 evil, ravening murder bot ships in your system, blowing everything up and killing all of your people. And yeah, there's nothing legally you can do about it, and there's nothing that's probably going to legally come from you then declaring war on it.
There's also theocracies don't tend to declare wars just simply because of the way that they tend to move troops. They'll declare a crusade internally, and then that crusade will just come for you. You'll probably know it's coming. You should probably have a good enough intelligence network to know, but you'll never receive a formal declaration of war.
Nice. So, I think that also kind of covered the how to build up and start a war properly from the ground up, really, as well, considering that you would start with proxies and contextual historical disagreements between the two. I guess, really, what other conflicts have we had within the galaxy that have exploded into legitimate conflicts that any of you guys can think of? Other than the second Ancerious War, of course. And the first.
No, I guess the Emerald War?
Yeah. I guess the Emerald War would count, considering that that's actually a good example of, two ethnic groups that have been divided and that they've slowly been, I guess, fighting a proxy war between each other and having a non-declared, unconventional conflict. And then now it's pretty much boiled over into an official conflict, even though war hasn't technically been declared.
Yeah, no one has declared. None of the actual countries that are fighting are at war.
Yeah. And none of the other nations that have come in to help the two sides have declared war either. They're just like, we're here to support the Republic of Sarabai, or we're here to support the Republic of Raman and Jaeger, or, we're here for humanitarian peacekeeping missions. Don't mind the 500 warships, there's no official, legally stuff going down. It's just lots of different conflicts and hot zones that are all just in turn escalating. Like, the conflict in the Tanakol system started off with a blockade of the planet by both sides' fleets, where neither side was sending down or letting through any sort of container ship, because anyone that was associated with the Sarabai government, the Raman and Jaeger people, were like, well, no, you're smuggling weapons down to the surface. And then obviously in turn Sarabai started doing that to any Raman and Jaeger civilian transports, and so no supplies started getting through. The supply situation on the planet started getting dire, running out of food, etc. People then started rioting. Then obviously they were like, well, it's the Sarabs that are doing this, or well, it's the Ramans that are doing this, and then the ethnic violence started, and both sides pretty much went into conflict. The two fleets in orbit opened fire over a particular situation, with one ship running the blockade, and then both sides started bringing in more forces and allied units, and then now it's just a huge, massive, I guess, clusterfuck of a battle in orbit and also on the ground as well. So,
Yeah. Also, the actual what you just said about the Emerald War brings like reminded me of something concerning the way that wars can be escalated, or like the actual spark that can light up a war. Is that like one thing that historically has caused some pretty huge wars are like extremist elements within the actual sort of armed forces. So the country might be playing this game of yes, we're at war, no, we're at war, we're going to pretend that we're not at war, we're just going to slowly escalate, and they're going to propagandize their own citizens like over it. But there might be actual people with power who actually buy into the propaganda and just start acting on their own, like not full blown going rogue and just attacking your own nation, but just acting independently of the central command, which is how a lot of which is how like the second Sino-Japanese war started. Like it wasn't Tokyo that told the generals in China go invade, like go just start shooting up Chinese and we're gonna have war. No, it was like some little incident that escalated, and some general in the actual Shanghai garrison of the Japanese army decided, okay, we're going for it. And by the time the central government actually like learned of what was happening, it was too late. And those generals that escalate wars by themselves might have political ambitions to just start going up the ranks of the government as the guy who conquered this place, for example. And this is I think more likely in nations where the military has a lot of like they don't have a lot of oversight, and militaries and like countries that have where the militaries have been kind of depleted, at least as far as discipline goes, where the central government does no longer holds that much authority over the actual independent units. And I said that the Emerald Republics reminds me of that because the situation in Raqqa is kind of like that. The most elite units of the Saram army are sort of engaging in their own battle and in their own decision to blockade all supplies to the Raman part without any actual intervention of the central government. They just said, "Okay, we're going to do this."
yeah, I think that perfectly adds in a little bit more flavour into how wars can start and the like. So, does anyone have any questions on how to build up and start a war properly from the ground up?
With the not actually declaring the war, how would that interact with defensive treaties? Because that sounds like it could get complicated.
It wouldn't. That would be one of the biggest parts of not declaring war. A defensive treaty typically, depending on how they're written, but most often specifies an attack or declaration of war. If there was no formal declaration of war and you're being attacked by essentially like funded jihadis in your own nation, that treaty's wording disallows response. Like it's not actually being brought up.
Yeah, the other nations may still help you to some extent, but there wouldn't be any need for, like, you suddenly have a massive incursion by some funded private military corporation that's just gone in and just bombarded one of your, like, I guess, frontier worlds into oblivion. They've just slaughtered all the people on the planet, they have destroyed the military elements in orbit, and they've ransacked the place, and they've now fucked off. And you know that Cora here did it. You know that the Corsicans did it. However, because the Corsicans didn't actually directly go and attack you, and they've clearly funded the whole endeavour through a shell company, your other two allies, say, Pickle and Blue, they then turn around and go, well, yeah, but they didn't outright attack you, so we're not really forced to send you forces, and we're not going to declare war on the Corsicans because they didn't outright attack you, and then, otherwise we're basically just sending our men to die. You've got to deal with this yourself. So
it kind of gives your allies an out, an excuse not to join. Like if they're really good allies, and if there is like wide political support for defending your country in their country, then yes, they're going to join. But if it's just kind of some very recent alliance, and they there's not really that much common culturally between your nation and theirs, then they're just going to say, oh no, well, you're not at war, why should we go defend you?
I was going to sort of add with sort of treaties in general to keep in mind is that more or less treaties are only sort of binding if it's convenient for both nations. Like in World War One, for instance, everyone sort of says, "Oh, Italy was allied with sort of Germany before World War One broke out, and then they switched sides." Technically, they didn't do anything wrong because their alliance was purely defensive, and Germany was on the offensive or whatever. They could have just stated that they had an alliance and went along with it, but they chose not to. And I think a good quote with that is from Bismarck, which is all treaties between great states cease to be binding when they come into conflict with their struggle for existence. Like if a state has nothing to gain from a treaty, then that says, oh, you got to join in this war, whatever, then they're probably not going to do it. They're going to find some clause or some little way to weasel out of it. They'll only join, or even if they don't have a treaty with a nation beforehand, then they'll join if they have something to gain afterwards. It's more really a formalization in modern diplomacy than anything.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they might send some special forces or token support, but just because there's some sort of fight going on doesn't mean that all of your allies are just going to sort of jump into the ring, guns blazing.
What I'm saying is basically don't expect because you got a piece of paper and you've just turned into some Stalinist state out of nowhere and you're at war with the entire galaxy. You can go up to some peasants unaligned state you got a treaty with and go, oh look, in sector 47B you have to join this war in which you're inevitably doomed. You can't really rule lawyer just and unless you've got the force to back it up to force treaties to come into existence if the nation doesn't want to join in it or respect it.
Yeah, I think that perfectly encapsulates that, and that kind of moves on nicely, I think, to what doesn't constitute a valid casus belli. And I think that I'll start by saying, and leading directly on from that just because you are in an alliance with another nation, and that nation gets into some sort of conflict, you can't then just immediately go, oh, I'm in the war. There you go, here's all my ships, we're going for it. That doesn't happen. Unless your nation actively get something out of that conflict, you have no reason to be in it. For example, for the Falklands War, as we mentioned earlier, it was Britain and Argentina. Now, the United States was neutral on both sides, but they're one of Britain's closest allies, but also other allies of Britain didn't just immediately jump into the war and go, oh yeah, fuck me, let's go kick the shit out of some Argies because we can go get some territory and economic benefits. Everyone just sort of turned to Britain and were like, okay, you can deal with this on your own, right? And Britain was like, yeah, all right. And that was it. yeah, okay, there was both sides received some economic supports, weapon supplies, etc., but no other nation sort of jumped in and immediately just started throwing aircraft carriers and strategic weapons around because they were like, oh yeah, shit, here's a good chance. Some examples for the group would be, you've got, I guess it would be the United Nations of the Ivarian as a sort of power block, and L1 manages to get into a war on the other side of the galaxy with the High Imperium. And it's a small conflict that's escalated over various things, and it's all good. Now, suddenly, if Nova comes to me with the Singers, and he says, I'm immediately joining the conflict, I've got all these ships here that I'm going to chuck in, and we're going to go stomp the shit out of the High Imperium and completely occupy the place, I'm going to turn around and say, well, what do you have to gain with it? Because you're on the other side of the galaxy from me as well. And, there's huge distances involved, there's context involved, you don't have any sort of, I guess, bad blood between you guys, and it doesn't make sense. So, just as, on the same thing of like, just because you've signed a piece of paper doesn't mean that you have to go to war, and the same thing is that, yeah, just because you signed a paper doesn't mean that you can just jump into a war, guns blazing, with no, specific, I guess, things that are going on. I mean, yeah, if somebody turns around and says, I'm officially invading your ally, and you have a treaty that stipulates you got to defend your ally being invaded, if it benefits you, you can do it, but I guess this is a good situation where we had the FDC after the Dectros or during the Dectros conflict, where the AGA and the other nations turned around and said, "Look, we don't have a problem with all of the rest of you. If you want to leave the FDC and not intervene in the war with the Dectros, we will leave you alone and we'll actively actually negotiate some trade deals with you." And the FDC, which was supposed to be an alliance bloc of self-defense, just turned around to the Dectros and went, yeah, you're on your own. We're not fighting all of these different nations. And they just had an immediate out. But again, yeah, you have the flip side of just because one guy in your alliance decides to declare war on someone or have a fight with someone doesn't mean that the rest of you in that alliance immediately have an in to just jump in the conflict and start fighting. So there's the two sides there that both tell you what not to do. Another invalid Casus Belli, in my opinion, is resources. Now, this is sort of contextual, depending on what setting you're in, but if someone ever comes to you and says, I'm going to invade you because your territory is clearly more resource rich than mine, because you have more heavy elements and whatever, tell them they're retarded. You've got enough resources in a solar system to do whatever the hell you want with for millions of years. If you have hundreds of solar systems in your territory, there's no reason why you would ever need to expand or go to war with anyone over resources. Now, if there are rare resources in an area, you would still never probably officially declare war with them. For example, in Ancerious, most of the rare resources that you can find are in very, very specific areas in the galaxy, and all of those specific areas are all neutral. There's no official, territory claims. So if you turn up and you see that somebody has access to a bunch of Ancerium FTL fuel in this small area, and you want it, you don't need to then be like, oh, well, I'm officially declaring war on you to take this Ancerium reserve. You just send in a fleet and you just fight them and you take that resource and then you harvest it for a bit until the next person comes along and kicks you off of it, and then vice versa, and so on and so forth. But there should never really be a position where one empire, especially a space nation, turns around and just goes, yeah, I'm declaring war on you because you have more resources than me and I can take your resource stuff, it doesn't make sense in my book, and it doesn't constitute a valid reason to go to war. Somebody else can correct me if they wish, but...
Yeah, nah, that time Japan bombed the Pearl Harbor of oil. It depends on how much of the resource you need, how critical it is to your nation's survival, and how doggedly the other nation is refusing you access to it. If your entire war machine's going to die if you can't get access to fuel, and basically the only way you can get access to it is to go through another nation, you're going to go through it if you can.
Although that still doesn't quite apply in Ancerious.
Space Empire.
Yeah, like, that doesn't really apply in Ancerious, because even with Ancerium FTL fuel, there's the out of, even if, say, every empire in the galaxy is cucking you out of harvesting natural Ancerium, you can still create artificial Ancerium using particle accelerators and that. It's not going to be as good, but you're still going to have access to fuel.
Sure, you can, but if you're fighting over a different resource, you can't just make out of nowhere. And Ancerium specifically, maybe not, but I could see a slave empire going to war over an inability to keep refreshing its economy with slaves, and it's just being denied it by a nearby liberal democracy.
I don't know if that would just be a resource thing, though. That seems more also like a social and political situation, just as much.
I think slaves count as a resource. It's the other ones, but it's not about resources.
I don't know if it's been said as well, but at least using model of sort of British expansionism in the East Indies and stuff, and Dutch and so forth. But if a commodity's valued high enough, a state might go about, even if the resource isn't like a necessity for a state's economy, a state might go about trying to monopolize control over a certain resource through wars and expansionism for the pure aim of sort of not blossoming, but monopolizing that entire trade and using it for their own ends to fuel their own economy effectively. I'm not sure how many cases that might apply to in series, but it's certainly something that there's case studies for.
I mean, I guess Corona's monopolised the Ancerium trade somewhat over the years, although I don't know if that would be a legitimate Cassus Belli to take it. Well, I guess it would for the unaligned, although that would be a hell of a build-up and mega conflict, but...
And you could pretty easily use it as you could pretty easily use monopolization of, like, Ancerium as the reason to go to war with someone. You'd easily hold the moral high ground. You just point at them and go like, oh, all these poor, burgeoning, new space societies that are being predated upon by the Coronans. Is it not our moral duty to just fucking free and fair trade?
Oh yeah, I mean, it would be a legitimate Cassus Belli against the Coronans, although... Yeah.
I mean, the Coronas don't really enforce military. It's not a matter of locking others out. They just have the biggest fleet, or like the biggest harvester fleet. It's not like they're stopping other people from harvesting. So in that, like, it's more like just how Russia has the biggest whaling fleet in the world. Yeah, they get a lot of whales, but it's not because their ships are just shooting other whalers. Like, it's not much of a casus belli to just blame Russia for monopolizing whaling.
I mean, I was only using Corona as an example. I wasn't saying that it's a 100% concrete one. Just that declaring war on people that are monopolizing things, or declaring war on other people to monopolize things, is something that we've, like, just sort of has happened. Like, it's a legitimate Cassus Belli because it's been used in real life as a legitimate Cassus Belli.
True, although I think that would be substantially pretty rare in Ancerious.
I mean, yeah, it's harder to sell than all the other ones. It's a lot easier to sell in, like, a monarchistic society where you're literally just like, I give. I need to keep my nobles happy, or they'll murder me in my sleep.
But I guess
Also, I think that there is one that is much more valid. That's kind of the flip side of the resource war. Is that like the market war? You go to war with another country to topple the government and open them up to your market, so then you can sell them stuff. And that's actually like a really, really common thing across the 20th century. We're not gonna take over like we're not just gonna take over their shit. We're gonna sell them our shit, and they are gonna let us. They are gonna open up our market, and then we're gonna be able to continue growing economically, and we're gonna have somebody who can absorb our industrial surplus.
that's definitely a good valid one.
Have we? I'm not sure. This might be backpedaling a bit, but have we sort of covered like a distinction between sort of scales of war, like limited wars and so forth?
Yeah.
Yeah, with escalation.
Yeah, okay, I was just checking.
I think that there was a bit. There was something that was missed in the escalation phase, which I think is just about the most important thing that you have to do if you're going to go to war with somebody, which is to lead it up with like all of the intelligence gathering possible. If you haven't had absolutely massive intelligence gathering on the country that you're going to get be invading, that invasion is going to last like a week before you just get completely annihilated by the people. And the thing is that that sort of intelligence operation is just all the time, and not necessarily with just your enemies. You also spy on your allies, or at least the people that are neutral.
It's a good point. Too many people have made blunders without intelligence in this group, both actually conducting intelligence and lacking intelligence.
But yeah, my point was just gonna be, yeah, like in a case of an invalid war or Cassus Belli, you like if you've had like a fucking civilian freighter get blown up in like first contact, don't send your entire navy to like conquer another interstellar empire.
Yeah. The sort of thing of also the thing of like, I think that also ties into the sort of what's not a legitimate Cassus Belli is expansion. The age old, I want to expand, I want to have more territory. Dude, it's space. There's plenty of space. There's plenty of space to go around. Like, you're not going to run out of Liban's realm, so to say, because all you do is you just build orbital habitats, or you just create a megastructure like a ring world or a Dyson sphere or a Dyson swarm, and you can just fit your entire nation's population on like one of those. It just doesn't.
I mean, if you try really hard, you could just feed any empire could fit their entire population in one system.
Yeah, exactly. So the whole thing of like,
A really good thing to get an idea of just how stupidly huge space is, even in one system. You can fit every other planet in the solar system between Earth and the Moon.
yep.
Mm-hmm.
See, territorial expansion doesn't make sense at all in space.
No.
Can you use the argument for
at least?
Sorry, can you use the argument of territorial expansion on the basis of strategic defense? Like, oh, this person's within such
to make a
close
buffer.
proximity.
That's actually more valid.
That's definitely
You want to
more
make-
valid. But
You
it's
want
harder
to
to pull off.
something between you and the.
God, I was actually about to say some of the lines of that. Territorial expansion doesn't make any sense, but there are reasons to expand your territory beyond expanding it for the sake of expansion. And yeah, that was the example I was going to use. Sometimes you just need to move people away from yourself. Also, if you're one of those if you're like a, what do you call them? Something like a consuming hive.
Oh,
I can see
devouring
you
swarms
expanding
thing,
your
yeah.
yeah, a devouring swarm. I can see you expanding your territory for the purpose of collecting like genetic information to improve with. But
You don't really
expansion
need
for the
the
sake,
territory for that.
yeah. I mean, may as well do it while you're expanding. Expansion for the sake of expansion doesn't really make sense, but expanding as a consequence of achieving another objective does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, Lucas's faction, the biggest faction in the game, has been expanding like an absolute motherfucker. Its borders are huge, but it's been doing it for reasons that aren't lol make circle bigger.
Yeah, like, if you've obviously taken in, like, another empire as, like, a vassal or something, and that's technically expanded your, or, like, if expanding your territory is a side effect of the conflict, as, like, say you've occupied them, and it's like, oh, I guess this area's ours now, like, that's not necessarily, like, the reason that you went to war, but obviously if it's a result of the war, then, you know, hey fucking ho, you're not going to say no to free shit, are you?
Oh, because you gotta remember, expanding your territory through war into other places, it comes with, you can expand your labor force. It's always a good one.
Just build more sex bots.
Yeah, you could just build robots at that point.
You could just build robots.
I mean, just fighting the war already requires a ton of robots.
It does, but if you're already a faction that uses flesh and blood workers still, and hasn't, for whatever reason, stopped using flesh and blood workers, then expanding your labor force is always nice.
I think an expanded
Especially,
consumer force is better.
Especially with factions like the snakes, whatever they are, the slavers. The Vanitas? Is the Vanitas that are the slavers?
Yeah, I think so. They were the slavers anyway.
Yeah, an expansion for slaves.
I have like a caveat on the slaves thing, which is a way that it's been made to work in Ancerious, which is that at least there are some slave nations in Ancerious that do not use the slaves for manual labor, but for mental labor, as like CPUs, and that does give you a reason to just get as many people as possible.
Yes. A bit like the brain farm, but on a more
scale.
level.
But yeah.
What Holy Wars? Have we talked about that?
Yeah. We have talked about Holy Wars.
We haven't talked about my favorite Cassus Belli.
Go on.
Ethnic conflict. They have blue assholes. You have a red asshole. They must all die.
Go on, Vic. What do you think?
Happen more internally.
What do you think about ethnic conflicts and their validity as Cassus Belli?
I think ethnic conflicts can only come from factions that were already like in touch. I think it's kind of I don't know. It doesn't seem to me like it makes sense that two like random fucking aliens that have never met each other would have ethnic tensions. But for example, humans from or like different races of aliens that evolved together, then they spread out and sort of form their own nations, would have like lingering resentments from millennia of just pre-industrial conflict and religious differences and just sort of racial stereotyping and whatnot. And that could and like countries that are already in that kind of in that like mindset are just gonna use like even the shittiest excuses to go to war with each other if they like truly hate one another.
So like an ethnic conflict would essentially require like a certain amount of background interaction between the two ethnicities. Like if you had the Ku Klux Klan Space Confederacy, they'd probably be pretty hyped to invade the new Wakanda technocracy.
Yeah, like in my opinion, they should either be two ethnicities that have either sort of stemmed from the same faction at some point. So, like for example, a good Ancerious example, apart from the Emerald Republics, would be the United Federation, where or Minson and Eos, where they're sort of both shards of a whole nation that came before that have split off, and due to various in-character story events and progression, now hate each other and have legitimate problems between the different like sides, I guess. But you know, if you had a situation where two separate alien species who don't even border one another or have only just turned up with one another are like, oh my god, the alien's bad, we need to kill it, oh my god, I'm xenophobic, we're gonna purge that, and it's like, and then they just declare war and start killing everything. It's like, okay, but you have no reason to do that.
And there's no precedent.
Yeah.
I've got a question. Does war against like a devouring swarm count as an ethnic conflict?
No.
Not
in my opinion.
Okay.
In my opinion, like, any sort of war against, like, so it's kind of funny because devouring swarms, crazed rogue AIs, or like ultra fanatic, zealous religious crusaders, they get the benefit of basically always having legitimate Cassus Belli to everyone else. But on the flip side, everyone always has a legitimate Cassus Belli against them. So they start kicking off and invading some other faction, and the liberal democracy, like 2 doors down, is like, well, time to break out the fucking bug spray or something again, and then they just go and kick the shit out of it, and it's like, oh look, we've just done the galaxy or region a favour by destroying or like fighting back these dudes. And they always have the sort of, I guess, the moral high ground to do so.
Things like devouring swarms and such are almost more of an environmental hazard rather than an actual opposition in a conflict, though.
I think that depends on how they're written. If they're like mindless, then
well, I think devouring swarms are a little different to hive minds. Like, a devouring swarm can be a hive mind, but when I think of a dirge, as weird as it sounds, I don't think devouring swarm. Because they don't really act like a swarm that devours everything they see.
Yeah, they've actually got like proper
story. We have diplomatic channels for fuck's like.
I don't think we do have a devouring swarm in Ankh anymore. We did.
We don't.
We did in the form of the Voliant.
Yeah.
But in my opinion, they were played in a quite poor fashion, and they were a good example.
The thing is that
go on.
An actual full-blown devouring swarm is just gonna. I don't think the setting lends itself to have that kind of faction, because they're just gonna run into the unaligned. Like, sooner or later, if you start killing somebody, then everyone that's left is going to unite to kill it.
That's the problem that I kept bringing up with the sort of whole devouring swarm or like rogue whatever trope, is that people who want to come in and play those factions, they usually last like a couple months, because they do 3 first contacts, immediately get into like a full-on conflict with those players, and then those players turn around and go like, oh, we're also being attacked by these individuals. They then work together, and then they just absolutely delete the threat.
I think you could make a devouring swarm work by getting them to act like late-stage Zerg, where their end goal is still consumption, but they're smart enough to be strategic about how they go about it.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of what the Dirge is. I think so, at least.
Yeah, I believe that's the Dirge methodology at the moment.
Although the fun thing about like this doesn't have much to do with the whole thing of fighting wars, but I think that a devouring swarm can work like instead of a military style faction, then more of a just gigantic infestation.
Russell, you are hot micing extremely badly at the moment.
Noise.
What about radical ethnic or religious groups? I mean, yeah, but like I don't see a radical religious group or ethnic group in a nation just decide to like carry out one instance and then the nation as a whole decides to declare war. Like, I don't think that's a valid Cassus Belli.
I also think it's a lot harder to declare war on a Crusader state than it is to declare war on a devouring swarm.
Yeah, for sure.
Like,
And
you put
there's
in a
not much
devouring.
point in.
So you put in a devouring swarm, like a actively hostile one, not like the Dirge. Well, that's just like eating everything it comes into contact with constantly. You can point at that and go, existential threat, let's fucking go. But a Crusader state that launches a crusade against like just another nation, that is just a conflict between two states. And like it is still just that. And especially in a liberal democracy, you're going to have a bit of a hard time convincing your senators or ministers or whatever you have to formalize a declaration of war against them, just because it is a state. It is an actual nation.
Mm. Lucas, you bring up a good point about ideological wars. Personally, I don't think that ideological differences, on their own, self-contained, necessitate a valid Cassus Belli. However, I do think that like polar opposite ideological differences form a very good basis to then work alongside other reasons to form a valid Cassus Belli. Because, for example, the Second Ancerious War, while obviously the APP and the AGA were like polar opposites, there was a lot of underlying other issues that were going on between the nations that, you know, constituted sort of, I guess, the icing on the top of that. Which is funny, and as we've said, like differences between ethnic groups because of faction splits, economic problems, military, previous military actions against one another. You know, everything sort of like came together, and then the ideological differences just, I guess, was the spark, like the sort of top end spark.
I think there's one case where ideological war might actually make sense. And that's where all the other problems actually stem from the ideological differences themselves. For example, like a slave state coming into contact with a state made of freed slaves, like that's an ideological difference big enough that I think that's actually fair reason for war.
I guess it would purely depend on the context, because if those nations are nowhere near each other, then like I don't see a reason for that. But say the freed slaves settle in a region of space, then they discover that there's a great big slaver nation next to them, and the slaver nation then starts probing their borders, then I absolutely believe that the freed slaves could then turn around and be like, look, we've got to strike first and we've got to strike hard, otherwise there's a good chance that we could, end up like we were.
I mean, there could also be like the other case if two countries are neighboring each other and one has a social revolution and becomes a socialist state. The other one is like, now is going to have to like control that somehow, because or else it's going to spread to its own borders. Kind of like a Germany in 1918.
Vietnam.
Yeah, I think ideological conflicts can be pretty bad.
I think ideological conflicts are hard to make legitimate, but I think there are extreme cases where it can be done. For example, when the Anointed joined the war against Capital, it was purely on an ideological, moral level. It was their opposition to the enslavement of humans, which they view as a sort of a religious mecca, that brought them into the war. It was nothing but religious ideology.
But yeah, I think what we're establishing very quickly is that context is key, regardless of what ideology gets brought up.
Yeah, like, I don't think liberal democracies should be crusading for democracy, really. I don't, not something they're really going to do. But, you know, Space Catholic Church might invade Space Jerusalem.
Go on, Isaiah, talk about the dirge. Go for it.
All right. So basically, in my opinion, a devouring swarm, a religious fanatic faction, or a rogue AI, by definition, need to be quite intelligent just to ensure their own survival, regardless of motive or reason they're like that. So a good example of how not to do a devouring swarm is the Voliant, because they just engaged in random wars every first attack. Almost immediately escalates into very drawn out and prolonged wars, and that pretty much ensured that that swarm would not to exist anymore. The Dirge, on the other hand, I feel are a devouring swarm handled well. Obviously, that's a bit of ego for my own writing, but basically, they view literally a devouring swarm should view everything as a resource, not just like, oh, we're gonna eat people because that's our shtick. It's they're gonna use diplomacy as a resource. They're gonna use other nations' kind of strife and tensions as a resource to further their own goals. So, like, the Dirge very much are a devouring swarm, but they are also doing it in a way that they leave positive impressions in nations and very much integrate themselves in the diplomacy of other factions. And that's more or less just a survival technique, where it's like, okay, even if we're going to go around and, delete civilizations because that's what we do, if we can convince other nations that it's not happening or hide it or kind of pivot ourselves, again, how Jesse put it, to be morally superior, then that's what a swarm would do, because it not only ensures its own survival, but it means that, even while they're going around doing that, any other individual nation who wants to go against the Dirge would potentially run up against the various allies and nations they've made positive diplomatic ties with, which actually would make it quite difficult to kind of, I guess, initiate an all-out war or act on that Cassus Belli, where the Dirge themselves wouldn't have as much hang-ups or difficulty bringing that to bear.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting way of
Yeah.
going about how to stop people from getting they're a big evil devouring swarm on you, but having your own method to just turn around and go, you look tasty.
Yeah, exactly.
The Voliant did have the capacity, from what I saw of them, to be good, because they were shown to, be capable of reason, rationale, and establishing relations with others. But the problem was, Alt just wanted to use them to stomp new people.
Yes. He did slowly actually get at least somewhat story orientated towards the end, but that's actually because both the Voliant and the system got told that they actually needed to have a story behind them, because originally they didn't.
Man, when it comes to zealously religious factions, I think there's three ways you can play them. The the fastest one is that you should, if you're going to play your religious faction as a crazed Crusader state, you need to play it with the knowledge that it's probably going to die. Like, make your faction and all that, but just be constantly conscious and aware of the fact that inevitably someone's going to kill you, and it's probably going to be like 5 people at once. You know, you should probably figure that out with people beforehand, because it's not conductive to just declare war on random people for like the sake of RP-wise. But if you've got people that are willing to have a crusade arc with you, then that's one way to do it. The other way is to have a religious nation whose church bureaucracy is so grand and grinding that effectively they can't machine gun declare wars. Like, if every single vicar has to sit down and do a fucking, like, 100-day communion and then vote before, like, then vote to vote about going to war, then, like, you're going to have, you're never going to have that problem where you're declaring war on too many people at once, because you just can't do it quick enough. Your own bureaucracy doesn't allow for it. Basically, play to the strengths of being a religious nation when it comes to not getting yourself killed. If you look at the Vatican, it takes the Vatican a long ass time to do anything, because it is very bureaucratic by nature. And then the third way is to just essentially have it be a theocratic nation that's calmed the fuck down a little bit. That's sort of a bit. They've had their New Testament written, essentially.
I think that's pretty nice. Although I have realised that we've gone way off topic by now.
I want to go more off topic. I have another note on that.
Go on.
If you want to play just a brainless devouring swarm that doesn't really engage in diplomacy and negotiate with people, I think it's better to play it as an infestation than as an actual military with a defined territory.
Yeah.
So like kind of how we threw the idea around that there's Zetians just about everywhere, or just Corona Lumpen in everywhere, like every like shithole, sewer, archaeology planet. Like there's tons of them just hiding in the little crevices, making guns, making drugs, blowing shit up, and they just keep reproducing and spreading. I think that's most like the closest that you can get to an actual devouring swarm.
Tyranids and Ankh when?
Now.
Nice. Anyway,
there's actually a devouring swarm in the lore. Like the Falmer Death.
Oh, yeah.
Who actually did go to war with everyone, and it went just about as well as you expect.
Indeed. But yeah, so to get back on track, to sum up the TLDR, how not to escalate wars, don't just throw ships at everything, don't just like immediately escalate and make it just seem organic. Like, what's a fair amount of economy of force in response to what the enemy are using on you? And just keep in mind what's actually going on in the story. But honestly, I think we've covered everything in the discussion, and plenty more besides.
I should go.
So I think I'm going to stop it there for tonight before we go crazy bonkers some more. So that's it from us for this round. There we go.
Based.
So